So I hate to start a video off with a tombstone. That's kind of depressing. Nothing about this hopefully is depressing though. Hopefully you're excited about learning chromatography, and hopefully you're excited about learning our HPLC instrument. That's what this is all about. But in a way, this tombstone is a celebration. It's a celebration of the discovery of chromatography. It's a celebration of a whole new era of science. It's a celebration of a whole new process now that can happen in a laboratory environment that makes our life much easier so we don't turn into this. Right? We don't want to be the person that's sitting on a stool in front of a piece of glassware only to be able looking out the windows and not being able to do anything else all day long. So thank you, TISVIET, for improving our knowledge of how to extract samples a little bit better. So again, very early in the days of chromatography, this is what this process looked like, and now we have came above and beyond this type of process that happens in a laboratory environment. And that's what we need to talk about now. So let's not waste any more time, and let's talk about this whole concept of high performance liquid chromatography. Chromatography is still there. I see it in the name, but there's more to the story. I at least now know that this HPLC instrument will separate things. How does it do that though? That's what now we need to turn our focus toward. So let's look at this name, HPLC. And we need to take a look at the name and we need to break it down. We need to fully understand what this piece of equipment is doing. And now I know what the C is representing. The C is standing for chromatography. And that now I know is just a fancy separation method. So that means this instrument will separate things. And to separate things, it uses a column with stuff on the inside of the column. And my sample is injected on the column. And it begins to separate out one by one. Okay, so that's the C for HPLC. All right. Well, what does the H stand for? H is going to stand for the word high. What does the P stand for? Well, P stands for performance. And the L stands for liquid. So HPLC stands for high performance liquid chromatography. Okay, now I'm going to come over here to the side, and I hate it when people do this, but I love it when I do it. I'm going to put a star out here, and I'm going to say P does not mean pressure. Great. Now you tell me that, and that's the only thing that I'm going to remember. P pressure, P pressure, P pressure. No, 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 no. P does not stand for pressure. If I never mentioned that, you might have not even made that relationship. You might have just said performance every single time and not thought about pressure at all. But this is the reason that I mention it, and this is why it's important. Because early on, it was called high pressure liquid chromatography. And the reason is because these machines ran under high pressure. So people made the relationship, oh, high pressure, that's what the P stands for in HPLC. And people started calling this high pressure liquid chromatography, but that's not really the proper term to use. It is called high performance liquid chromatography. Well, what do you mean by high pressure? Okay, well, on a roundabout tire, you're looking at a range, give or take, of 50 psi, right? So you're going to fill a tire full of air until it gets to about 50 psi. So if you go over and you fill the tire, you know how full that tire has to be. and we measure that using a PSI unit known as, do you remember? PSI? Maybe that's something I should look for, because maybe on this Chemtechathon multiple choice test that you will take at the end of this event, units could be important. So units like MOL, what does that stand for? What does PSI stand for? What does PA stand for? Maybe you'll see some of those. So take a look at PSI, see what it means. Don't miss out. So 50 PSI is typical tire. Well, for HPLC, we typically run about 1500 PSI. Ha 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 ha. Now I know why people call it high pressure, because this is super high pressure that this machine requires in order to do the separation. So this is why the misnomer is out there, and that is why very early on in the beginnings people started calling this high pressure liquid chromatography, because they were so taken back by the pressure that was required to run these samples that that's all that they could think about was high pressure. Okay, so what does really high performance mean? Well, high performance basically means quick. If you are a high performing athlete, that means you get the job done well, and you get the job done fairly quickly, right? That's high performance. So a high performance instrument is an instrument that does the job quick, and it does the job well, and it does the job without any problems or back talk at all. Sometimes the equipment can get a little sassy. HPLC, though, typically behaves itself for the most part. So quick and well, that's high performance. Quick analysis times, they can separate multiple components. 50 or 60 components can be separated off using HPLC. And it can also tell you amounts, concentration-wise, how much is actually there. Liquid. What does the liquid mean? Well, liquid means, if you go back to that analogy and how we described chromatography very early on in a couple of previous videos, we said we had to keep adding liquid to push the molecules through. Well, there's instrumentation in the lab that's chromatography based that doesn't use liquid to do it. It uses other things. But HPLC uses liquid to push components through those columns that's filled with that stuff. So all of those pictures that we saw of that poor little guy sitting on the stool looking at that piece of glassware, you know, he was adding liquid to the top of that column. That's liquid chromatography, because the liquid was pushing the components through so I could separate them one by one. So that's what HPLC represents. It is a chromatographic method, aka separation, that relies on liquid, hence the L, that separates things fairly quickly and can separate things that are very complicated, hence high performance. That's all that this instrument does. Okay, well, I've got to clear up quick. Sometimes 5 minutes is all that it takes. Other times, quick could mean 65 minutes or more. And this can be a problem with HPLC. Depending on the sample that you are running, and depending on what you want to do with the sample, and what you want to look for with the sample, these analysis times can be quick, meaning an hour or longer of runtime. The reason that an hour is called quick is because if you did not have this under high pressure and you did this by hand, that 1 hour on the machine would be maybe 1 week in the laboratory if you had to do it by hand. Imagine that. A week of separation? You're going to sit on that stool for 8 hours. Someone else is going to come in, take over your shift, and that person is going to sit on the stool for 8 hours. And then another person is going to come in and take over that shift and sit on the stool for 8 hours because you constantly have to add liquids to these things to separate them. No. Please. That's crazy. That's the power of the instrumentation. So even though an hour to you might seem long, just imagine and remember that this hour runtime is much, much longer if you had to do it without the piece of equipment that's involved. Okay, so that's HPLC in the nutshell. All right, so if we go back and we take a look at HPLC and start talking about maybe some more definitions. We now know what chromatography means. Color separation. But color no more, because I don't have to rely on color any longer. This separation process that we're talking about as the components come off of the column one by one, this process is called elution. E-L-U-T-I-O-N. Elution. Again, that's a fancy word that's meant to make us sound smart. I don't want to say the things separate. I want to say the things elute. That makes you sound much smarter, right? So why not use it? So elution is the proper term that we use to separate or describe the separation process that goes on inside of these columns. So two things are required, a liquid and a solid. The stuff that I fill inside of the column and the liquid that I pour to push the things through. Well, again, I want to sound smart. I don't want to say the stuff that I use to fill the column. What I want to say there is stationary phase. We have a stationary phase inside of the column, aka chalk. Well, chalk's not really used anymore. We have another version of it that works a little bit better, but that's basically stationary phase. Again, it just makes me sound a little smart when I use it. And the liquid that I pour into the top of the column that pushes this stuff through, well, we don't call it the liquid that I use at the top of the column. What I use there is this term called mobile phase. Mobile phase is what I use to describe that liquid. Again, it makes me sound smart. So I have a column that requires stationary phase and a mobile phase, and the stationary phase and the mobile phase allows the components to elute. See how clever that was? I sounded like a smooth talker. Try that on your next date. Use these fancy words. Make yourself sound smart, like you've got your stuff together, like you are ready. You're ready to graduate. You are ready for college. Use terminology like this. You'll impress people. And then what can happen through this process is that if I begin to change the stationary phase and the mobile phase, my separation changes, right? The stationary phase were my flowers. So if I use something else besides flowers on the end of that tunnel, and maybe chocolate bars instead, are bees really going to be attracted to those chocolate bars like they were the flowers? Probably not. So the selection of the stationary phase is very important. The selection of the mobile phase is also very important. The mobile phase, well, it does a job too. It's very important for me to kind of go through and pick out what is proper that will make the best sense. And this is going to be part of a process known as method development. So method development is me going through and setting up the criteria. What stationary phase do I need? What mobile phase do I need? What kind of components am I looking for? That is the process of method development. Sometimes people are hired for a company and that's all that they do. They do method development all day long. They go into a lab and they start messing around with stationary phases and mobile phases and other things that are related to the equipment, and they just try to improve the method that they're currently doing. Or maybe they want a method to do something new. Method developers go in and that is what they do. They solve problems and they play around with settings on the equipment all day long to try to find the best scenario possible. So in the next video, we will come back and we will talk about the mobile phase and stationary phase in a little bit more detail. So that way you've got a better understanding of how this process is set up.